Thank you very much, Katie. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really thrilled to be back in Munich. It's been a number of years since I was last here, and this is an exciting opportunity for me. I want to thank the Rachel Carson Center for having me. And if I can get this thing hooked up, my hands should be more nimble than this. I used to be a guitar player, but
not too much water. Did you turn it on?
no. We need to unmute. We will need to unmute. Okay, now we're going.
Better?
Before I start my talk, but I'm told I have to stay here, but I do want to present to the Rachel Carson Center a copy of my latest book, An Unnatural or A State of Disaster. So I'll hand that over to Christoph when this is over. Archaeologists, there are probably not many in the room, make a living unearthing landscapes that have been abandoned, and abandonment is a big topic here. Their work, and also that of historians, has demonstrated that oftentimes climate change, along with a number of other factors, contribute to migration away from settlements and their abandonment. Whether that process is rapid or very slow, it does occur. And with migration, there is both a point of departure and a destination. And actually, oftentimes the archaeologists know much more about departure points that have been abandoned and left as relics than the place of destination. But historical scholars can also reveal more than just the footprint of past sites or the pathway from departure to destination. They can oftentimes do research that exposes the rationale behind a departure, something beyond a biophysical force that prompts people to leave. They can look for the rationale of the decisions about what to take and what to leave behind or what to abandon. And I've been doing work on the prospects of climate-induced migration from coastal areas, particularly in Louisiana where I live, and have been doing work for the last 20 plus years. But I've expanded in recent years to the broader Gulf of Mexico, the southern coast of Louisiana, or the southern coast of the United States. And I'm beginning to consider the implications of large-scale abandoned landscapes, large-scale massive migration of large numbers of people, not just from rural areas, but from cities. And what does that mean in terms of what's happening not just in my home state, but elsewhere? For some context, globally, some 267 million people live less than 2 meters above sea level, and they'll be threatened by flooding by the end of this century, with just even a 1 meter rise in sea level, with storm surge and high tides and the combination of those. And the UN estimates that about 1.2 billion people will be displaced by climate and weather-related hazards. And that's not just sea level rise. So there will be a huge number of departures and likely many places abandoned. Across the United States, about 10% of the land area is in what they call coastal shoreline counties, counties that actually touch the coast. And they will be threatened by flooding by 2100. 40% of the population lives in this 10% of the land area, and that percentage of the population has been increasing rapidly over the last several decades. And what this means is that more people will be at risk, more property will be at risk, and that will mean more motivation for people to move away from risk and that means more settlements will be abandoned. Louisiana, which is on the Gulf Coast of the United States, has the highest relative rate of sea level rise in the country. This is a combination of both sea level rise, but in a process that's been going on much more rapidly, which is the land subsiding. A recent delta in geologic terms, sinking under its own weight, basically. The state has lost about 1,800 square miles, and I forgot to convert that to hectares, I'm sorry. It lost about 1,800 square miles since the 1930s, not even a century of time. That area has large numbers of people in vulnerable situations, exposed, and there's much of the coastal area is less than 2 meters above sea level. You can go 50 miles inland and not hit the 2-meter elevation. And there's some 2.2 million people who live in the coastal parishes or counties out of a state of about 4 million. So roughly half the state's population live in this exposed area. People have been studying this intensively since the 1950s, the rate of land loss, and they expect to see another 2,200 square miles of land loss in the next 50 years if a very expensive program to restore bits and pieces of the coast isn't completed, it's underway. But if it's not completed and it doesn't function as intended, that additional expanse will be lost to the sea. That means more people will leave the coast, and people are already moving away. So in recent years, despite the acceptance of the notion of land loss in Louisiana, there has emerged a deep-set resistance to any discussion of relocation, migration, resettlement, or particularly the term managed retreat tends to get a really, really strong reaction among the residents who live in the coastal parishes. They fundamentally object to the notion that the state might ask them or demand of them to leave their homes and move inland. Yet, at the same time, and for well over a century, as we've documented, people have been using relocation as an adaptation, as a means of survival in a perilous place. This is not long-distance migration. It's small, modest leapfrogs in what we call in Louisiana up the bayou, the many streams that feed into the Gulf of Mexico from the coast. But these are modest inland migrations of families, in some cases parts or whole villages, moving towards safer and higher ground. In the course of my recent work, I've begun thinking about the broader implication of not just tiny hamlets moving inland, but I've begun to wonder about the decisions societies will make about abandonment of their valued landscapes, those buildings and structures they treasure, the things that they do not want to leave behind. Homes that are the center of family life, government buildings that represent local political cultures, churches that embody the religious beliefs of communities, and cemeteries that contain the precious remains of family members. So I seek to draw on studies of migration, abandonment and dereliction, and landscapes to answer some fundamental questions. And here are the questions. As people have departed communities and abandoned, departed communities and abandoned familiar lived-in landscapes to the effects of rising seas, what decisions and actions have been taken to protect or preserve, to relocate or replicate valued landscapes? And how does this vary from place to place and culture to culture? And finally, what do historical examples have to tell us about the processes of climate migration, settlement abandonment, and landscape protection or reproduction in the age of global warming and rising seas? And to get at this, I will consider several historical examples. Some where people retreated from the coast due to climate or geological processes. Others where economic change prompted departures, warfare, toxic waste sites, and disease have all impelled people to leave places that they were familiar with, and the abandonment of familiar landscapes. What landscapes were of such cultural significance that they demanded more than simple abandonment? Let me just kind of walk you through some basic ideas that I've drawn on from these different literatures as a way to set up this project. By definition, at least the definition I will use, migration is a physical movement of people from one place to another. It may be fairly long distance or it may be fairly short distance, but generally it's for longer than a seasonal practice such as transhumance or migrant farm labor. And it's also not temporary evacuation following a disaster. And I'll also consider migration as an adaptation to changing conditions, not a maladaptation or a failure, as some people have asserted. The type of migration I'm going to be looking at is what the migration scholars talk about as a voluntary movement. Sea level rise will induce what is generally referred to as involuntary migration, not due to direct demands from government authorities, but due to gradual environmental change that makes life more difficult and risky. It's not evacuation from a hurricane or a flood, but sometimes those impel people to embark on longer-term migrations. But this type of involuntary migration can produce deliberate attempts to resituate people for survival, or at least to reduce risk in distance, at greater distance from the coast. So people will relocate in gradual trickles, atomistic departures, but then also in pulses after disaster. After Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, the city lost about 20% of its population. I think this is sort of the way we'll see people retreat from the coast in general. You'll see gradual migration between dramatic events with accentuated by pulses of larger numbers of people. We're seeing this in recent years with other hurricanes that have hit Louisiana. With migration due to sea level rise, there will be certain areas that will be impacted most directly. And this map shows the blue areas, which are the coastal counties that indicate those most exposed. But each of these places has a very different coastal situation. Louisiana has low marshy areas. California has, and Oregon has giant cliffs along the coast. So there's not as much, sea level rise will have a much greater impact in certain areas than in others and prompt different rates and different scales of departure. Migration generally, particularly in terms of climate-induced migration, tends to accentuate inequities. That is, the wealthy and the poor who can't afford to leave. The wealthy can afford to stay and armor their dwellings or their residences. The poor don't have the means to evacuate or retreat. And we see, so you have a very bipolar economic structure where those who have the basic means to depart will, and you have a very unequal situation, and it really breeds problems at the local level. Also, this type of migration amplifies demographic trends. New Orleans was seeing a deep population loss before Katrina, and Katrina accelerated that pace of departure. And I think we'll see that same sort of thing. Areas that are seeing population growth will see less out-migration than those that are already losing population. And this is also, importantly, a very slow onset of event, gradual impacts inducing more of a trickle than the rapid movement. It's a slow-moving disaster. And also, what this map doesn't really show very clearly, but generally with most migrations for environmental reasons, there's fairly short distance movement. People want to stay close to what's familiar, to family, friends, and community and familiar institutions. And this map shows a tremendous surge in people moving to the Great Plains in the United States. And I think that's because those are areas that have been losing population. There's plenty of unoccupied real estate, but I don't know that people that live in the coast are going to want to go to the heart of the country. So I don't know if this map is entirely accurate, but you can see at least on the eastern seaboard where it does show that in the Gulf Coast, fairly short distance migrations are predicted. Now in Louisiana, we can see here, this is NOAA's projected sea level rise. We see a large area, the coastal area, is threatened. This is basically the settlement pattern. People don't live evenly dispersed across the landscape. They live along the bayous and narrow fingers of land, but that means most of the land that's habitable is already inhabited. So when people move inland, they're going to have to intermingle with residents who are already there on the ground. And this just shows you one of the typical linear settlements that are common. That's Bayou Lafourche, and you see the community of Golden Meadow, which has actually been the recipient of 2 prior hurricane-induced migrations. But people move there because it's within a protected levee system. But this demonstrates, this is the situation that exists in Louisiana that accommodates this short distance migration, this settlement pattern. If we look at the literature on abandonment and dereliction, there's many reasons for abandonment, as I've mentioned, and dereliction commonly results from that. From when things are abandoned, there's neglect, there's lack of upkeep, and over time, structures tend to deteriorate. Back in the 1960s, there was a lot of writing on urban blight in the United States, which was as new economic opportunities arose in the suburbs, capital was pulled out and transferred to the suburbs, and inner city structures, retail, industrial, commercial, all went into a phase of dereliction. It was labeled blight. It was something undesirable and a terrible condition for the urban landscape. And John Jekyll and Derek Wilson's book on derelict landscapes makes the case that changing political economies related to urban landscape transformation were powerful forces behind this. And we even gave an acronym to this process, TOADS, temporarily obsolete, abandoned derelict structures. So it has to be a prominent landscape process or situation to acquire a acronym. But that abandonment and dereliction in neoliberal terms provided an opportunity. Eventually, you let a place run derelict long enough, the property value falls, and it becomes prime real estate for redevelopment, rehabilitation. And we use the term back in the 80s and 90s of adaptive reuse. Now, the term that makes me cringe is repurposing, but it's all a process of cycles of decay and rehabilitation. In this situation, with sea level rise, the opportunity for repurposing and adaptive reuse just won't necessarily be there. Sea level rise will be a longer term situation, and you won't be able to go, and entrepreneurs won't be able to go back in and rehabilitate the landscape with the same speed. And it's really, and also, this is not a situation that's really well suited to disaster capitalism, which really follows the same basic principle, capitalizing on disaster, taking advantage of federal resources, government money coming in to redevelop in a certain way. The third of these elements, landscape. Landscape studies really blossomed in the United States under the guidance of Carl Sauer, a geographer at the University of California, Berkeley, who viewed landscapes as material structures that enabled the mapping and diffusion of culture regions, a really sort of limited view, and he's been subjected to pretty serious critiques. But a newer generation of landscape scholars have informed us that landscapes are not just fixtures dropped on the ground that follow a rigid cultural template. Rather, they include structures that reflect the cultural values and beliefs of a society. They can change over time, adapting to new circumstances, and they embody multiple cultural influences. They're socially constructed and reflect more than function and traditional cultures. And they embody the social, economic, and political milieu that, in which they were built and exist. They're lived in, and they're both shaped by the people who construct them in a manner fitting to local situations, economic conditions, and power relationships. And through their form, they can contribute to shaping activities within them. They're imbued with meaning and social value. Therefore, in some cases, they may warrant reconstruction following migration. And I'm really going to try to consider those landscapes with social and cultural meaning that are worthy of transporting in some way, shape, or form by displaced people. I'm approaching these as a historical geographer, these interrelated topics. And I'm thinking about these as part of my typical approach to look at the practical value of understanding past examples in the face of current situations. We can consider risk, the physical setting, the biophysical setting, geology, hydrology, biogeography, risk, the physical setting, and culture are all local. And so each wave of departures from one place, from a different physical setting to a different location, will be different. There's no common formula to guide us on how adaptation will occur, how migration will occur, how landscape preservation or protection will take place. So what I want to do next is go through a series of examples as a way to point out the type of sources that can be used to accomplish this. And this is what I'll be working on while I'm here over the next several months. In terms of examples from migration, I'll rely on a lot of examples from Louisiana. From prehistory to the present, migrations have been a core cultural practice of people, particularly in coastal Louisiana. In prehistory, indigenous people built mounds and middens in the coastal area, in the marshes. And we see many scattered about in the coastal parishes here. And many of them actually were built closer to the coast than they are today. Because these people were actually, as the delta was being built, they were following the delta seaward. And one of the early scholars in our department who was interested in coastal geomorphology found these archaeological sites the best way to trace the advance of the delta before the modern geophysical techniques came into use. So they actually built mounds that they were village sites where they lived, elevated village sites out in the marsh in that Big Oak Island, which doesn't show as an island anymore because it's been exploited for the shells. But this was evidence that people were there and they were moving towards the coast. Three major coastal cultures in Louisiana have very strong and enduring memories of tragic diasporas that continue to shape their attitudes towards leaving their homes. So this kind of culture history is really important when considering will people move, how fast they will move. And many of them, since they have moved already, they've adapted to those places already, and that their current homes are permanent and they're deeply attached to those places. If we look at the Native American migration history, due to warfare and attempts at enslavement, many were driven from their locations actually further inland towards the coast because the French and later the Spanish weren't that interested in wading out into the marshlands, so they sought sanctuary in the coastal areas. And then in the 1830s, many Native Americans were rounded up and shipped to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma in a situation known as the Trail of Tears, and they typically have a very deep adversity towards any effort to encourage them to leave their coastal homes. Enslaved Africans arrived during one of the most tragic diasporas. On the Middle Passage, they came They were delivered in chains from, they were delivered from Africa in chains and settled in Louisiana. And they also, but they see that diaspora as in part as a signature of survival. They endured that and still survived. Acadians also came displaced from Canada in 1755. Some found their way to Louisiana, and they really see the Grand Arrangement as a marker of their survival. But they still have a deep attachment to place. This is one of the more interesting representations of migration. This shows the green dots are where there are post offices, and post offices have been, when populations decline, post offices are closed in small villages. And this shows the gradual mean, distance, and direction of post office movements. That is, when one is closed, the mail is redirected to another post office. And this shows the direction of that redirection of post offices. All but one are moving inland. And so this type of record of government records indicates a process that's been going on for well over a century in coastal Louisiana. The Ile-de-Jean Charles Native American community in coastal Louisiana has been seeking relocation since the 1990s. And the state got a grant recently, several years ago, and they've mostly been moved now. But this shows the process of land loss. The island is the one area with a lot of white, and you can see it right in the center in 1963, and then in 2008, it's surrounded by more water than land. And this is the road leading to Ile-de-Jean Charles. Whenever there's a high tide or even a small breeze or wind from the south, the road was covered up, meaning no school buses, no ambulances, no fire trucks, no commute to work from the island. In terms of abandonment, there have been many examples of abandonment following hurricanes and climate-related events. We can look at two examples here, Indianola, Texas, and Diamond City, North Carolina. These are towns that were abandoned. Not much is left of either one today, but there are some historical records of those abandonments. In coastal Louisiana, two noteworthy examples were the Chenier Caminada. Those people moved up the bayou, and then later, most of those people have moved up the bayou again to this town of Golden Meadow that I showed you earlier. Manila Villages was basically a Filipino fishing community. They disappeared largely after the 1965 Hurricane Betsy, and that's one that really is lacking a decent historical reconstruction. A forced migration from a small community, African American community on the banks of the Mississippi River, Point Pleasant. They had to abandon their cemetery as the Corps of Engineers tore down a section of levee that used to protect this village to open up a drainage passage for excess water. Nicholas Pinter's done a magnificent reconstruction of many managed retreat efforts using basically historical records of government agencies that were involved, both the Emergency Management Agency and the Corps of Engineers and others who assisted and guided these relocation efforts. If we look at landscape preservation and restoration, certainly one important step is inventory of threatened areas. And the archaeologists, of course, are all over this one trying to document, record, and do salvage archaeologies of places that are particularly threatened. We can look at historical cartography to find examples of movement of towns and what they looked like before departure. There have been a few examples of actually moving buildings. This lighthouse in Scotland, and perhaps the most dramatic one was in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. They raised a giant hotel, put it on rollers, and built railroad tracks, brought in engines, and drug it several hundred feet. Is a really remarkable relocation. And an example of simply vertical evacuation. When Chicago had to rebuild its downtown area, to lay sewer lines to try to avoid cholera outbreaks, they elevated the city. And if you go to Chicago, the Loop is basically this area that's elevated. Galveston, Texas did much the same thing after a 1900 hurricane. This house on the left shows the house raised before the sand was pumped in. And on the right, the same house, the same man standing with marking out a point there, shows that house raised up about 15 feet And some of the sea was raised 15 to 20 feet. But this is the kind of documentation. You can find examples in the historical record of these efforts to relocate. The Tennessee Valley Authority moved people out of areas where their reservoirs were intended. And there was a giant controversy over how to deal with small local church cemeteries. And the TVA, the federal authority, wanted to put them all in one giant memorial ground. Local people wanted them resituated to their local churches that they rebuilt as they moved. And so this is just another example of the type of documentation you can come up with. In New England, when New Englanders moved into the interior of the country, into Ohio, they basically rebuilt towns to look like the familiar places in New England. So this was, they didn't abandon places. The population got a little too dense in New England. They moved west, and this was after the Native Americans had been displaced. And they weren't building on a tabula rasa, but they were building in areas that basically the pre-colonial population had been removed. This shows the little community of Leeville. It was kind of the halfway point between Chenier, Kamanana, and Golden Meadow. This is what's happening to their cemeteries. One is on the edge of a shipping channel, and another one they've tried to protect by pouring concrete over it. This is perhaps, this is a picture of one of the most internationally discussed examples of climate migration, and this is the Ile de Jean Charles community. This shows some of their houses after the Hurricane Ida in 2021. Most people lived in these elevated houses. Many were in pretty poor shape before the hurricane, but they were even in worse shape afterwards. This is the state's plan for the new Isle, which is the place they're moving, or they have basically moved the residents of the Ile de Jean Charles to. This shows the new houses that were built. And basically, the one thing that was not done for these people, they wanted elevated houses because it's additional workspace. It's in the shade. You get a breeze, which you don't get working in the kitchen inside. And the planners thought elevated house would be a little too costly. By way of some tentative preliminary conclusions, I think what we'll see is that, I think what I'll find is that people are really reluctant to depart. That's common, I think, in the literature today and in what we're finding already. We'll see short distance moves to stay close to the familiar. In terms of abandonment, there'll be resistance to abandonment. The pace of departure and impact of sea level rise will be particular to local conditions. In terms of the landscape, inventories and documentation will occur. We'll see temporary elevating of structures as we're seeing in the Louisiana coast now, like Galveston in some senses. And we'll see structural protection of levees and dikes to try to protect the most expensive urban real estate. And I think replication is going to be unlikely because most migration will be to places that are already inhabited. Although we will typically see memorials, I think, will become part of this move. And in terms of one final comment, I think we'll see that there's never been an attempt to manage a transition of this scale. It's never been done. And even the small scale ones haven't always been very successful. And it likely won't be done in a way that's either efficient or equitable. But I think if we look closely at examples of cultures with a tradition of moving towards safety, that's one place we can gain inspiration and guidance on how to go about assisting with the relocation of people from threatened coastal areas. Thank you.